messages that it spreads. Sorry, I'm not touching
No,
anything.
it's okay.
The messages that it spreads is like not always positive, and her son's too, so she doesn't like him listening to those negative messages and all the rest of that. So like it's not like an old thought, so it's definitely there, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's really, like, I suppose if you're looking at terrorism in the sense of terrorizing, thank you, terrorizing like people or kids or anything else, it depends what you define as terrorism. Like, my lecturer at uni had a really interesting definition. He was like, it involved power and making somebody else feel small. And so he said that, well, parents could terrorize their children, people in power can terrorize everybody else. Yeah. And if you look at it, terrorism from that definition, then I think you can have a look at if somebody with an enormous amount of power, like a music artist or something, builds this image that's like a false expectation for, you know, young girls to have a certain way of behaving, or wear certain makeup, have certain lips, or like, you know, Nicki Minaj is famous for like having like that
body.
Yeah. Like it sets up this maybe unrealistic expectation, right? And then young girls feel powerless. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, you could probably say that, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of passive terrorism there. If that is a definition for terrorism, involving power and degrading others. Just a weird thought that my lecturer came up with a while back.
That's interesting. I don't know, I guess maybe when I think of terrorism, I kind of think of the universal definition for terrorism, which is basically just actually military or physical force against others to terrorize them in that light. But when it comes to like actually trying to make some people feel inferior or whatever, I wouldn't say music is terrorizing in that form. I think what would be terrorizing would be if people control what type of music, like if there's censorship or the government has certain control over what type of freedom of expression could be expressed by artists. And I think like someone like Nicki Minaj, yeah, okay, maybe her lyrical content is not the same as that of the 80s or 90s when things are more political, but I still think she definitely does represent some segment of the population when it comes to that whole social media hype or that whole overt sexualization of the music industry. So I think so long as music can be allowed to be some form of freedom of expression by artists, I think that's what we should probably try and preserve the most.
Freedom of expression.
No thoughts? How about yourself?
I guess I wouldn't say exactly like you see, like it's terrorizing everyone, because for that word you would think war and things like that, like violence, and that isn't what we see in the music industry. But I do understand where that's coming from, because like if you do have music playing and you have a child in the house, they will tell you that's a bad word and what are those moves, you know? And it is like showing kids inappropriate behaviour which they shouldn't see, especially if you look at like all the 12-year-olds on Musical.ly and you're just like, what are you doing? You know?
And they're like 5.
Yeah, it's disturbing. So I don't know, I'm a bit on the fence about that. I kind of agree, but I wouldn't use exactly that word.
Yeah, I'll probably say that it shows probably not values that parents would probably want for their children, but that could be said about any industry, whether it's a movie industry, whether it's a fashion industry with certain body images being, you know, deemed as a perfection of the female body or whatever. But I guess my whole view is not centered. For example, my favorite artist is probably gonna be someone like Michael Jackson, who does have lyrical content and something like that. But then he definitely does have songs that are like, you know, explicit in that nature that you guys are like, you know, against or whatever. So I think it really comes down to, at the end of the day, does an artist have the right to say whatever he or she wants, just like how people have the right once they get into office, right? So I think it all comes down to that whole democratic element of freedom of expression.
Yeah. But do you think Michael Jackson lets young people become who they are as opposed to like Beyonce or Nicki Minaj? Do you think he had more to shape people of that time rather than
I think just
who
like
we have now?
Naomi was saying, like old school singers like MJ definitely paved the way for certain, you know, groups in the music industry. But I think in total, I think it's really up to personal agency and parental values that should really dictate their children's value system. And if you're failing to do that as a parent, then I don't think that's the fault of a singer.
Sorry. What we've circumvented this whole time, though, has been the way that Beyonce, Nicki Minaj, and Kendrick Lamar have all performed at the Grammys, and they've all had a very, very strong message of Black Power. And we've had Beyonce and Black Lives Matter. We had, I believe it was Kendrick Lamar's last year, I think it was at the Grammys, where he performed, where he was talking about black incarceration and Black Power. And so, yes, we did discuss how, I guess, these black female role models are incredibly sexualized, but then again, they also have very, very strong messages of self-acceptance and Black Power. So, and I think, yes, the sexualization is very subtle and insidious, but then again, the message of Black Power is more overriding in a sense. So I think they can have both positive and negative elements to that.
Yeah.
But for them, the over-sexualizing thing is feminism, you know.
And
For
it can
Beyonce,
be...
she's a feminist. So she's owning her sexual rights, as if say women don't have those, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like just the industry itself sexualizes.
Yeah. And it's almost more of a cultural problem rather than a mistake of the artists themselves, because as pop stars they're expected to be that way, and that's the only way that they're accepted. And so they have to fit into that mold to almost get a level of success, which then gives them the voice to speak out about those I guess issues as well.
I guess in a way it's for them fighting like social construction about women's rights and things like that. To them, they're doing a good thing.
Yeah, and also I think the overt sexualization of like the music industry is not imposed on it by like some exterior force. I think it's also what the society wants. I mean, there's a reason.
It's in demand.
I think it's like just the product of evolutions in our cultural, you know, nature in society, and sexualization has just become one of those things, whether it's in the marketing industry or the music industry, the fashion industry. I mean, even in a current affair, there would be like certain sexual overtones, you know, like when they're trying to like premiere their latest episode and whatnot. So I just feel like sexualization is just a product of a liberal society.
Alright, so the bit about music, I found that a lot of it was talking about the person and the artist and how they portray themselves. But I feel like the parts that we were talking about, how the actual content that people are coming up with and these artists are producing is vastly different now than what they were producing in the past, even though the same issues that they were talking about them are relevant to this day and age. I feel like even though the topics haven't changed, we've progressed so much as the 21st century, the topics haven't changed, but for some reason we no longer find it relevant to empower young people to talk about Black Lives Matters until major events happen. I feel like music is a form of expression, and that's the raw truth of it. This day and age, it needs to be expressed, and I feel like the thought of being politically correct is like everybody is trying to be politically correct in this day and age, and that completely you can't be politically correct if you're standing up for what you believe in, and standing up for what you believe in is what you should. That's the kind of music that you should be portraying.
Happens, you know, like that TV show is one of my favorite TV shows ever. But we happen to see a lot more of female explicit content than we do of male explicit content, and I think that's also because, generally speaking, men are wanting to see that more, and so they're getting what they want, whereas it's not equal. We don't really see as many women doing nude scenes in Game of Thrones as we do. I mean, yeah, I feel like it's one-sided more so.
And that's probably because of the dollar value, but also because it was written by men, written by a man. And I'm not sure who produced it, but I'm guessing most of the behind the scenes would probably be men running it as well, and probably a large part of their audience.
What do you guys think of the actual content that they produce? Because that's their whole image, and they can take their image and use it for good or bad or whatever, right? But the actual content that they're producing in their songs today is way different to the actual content of music, like back in the 80s or whatnot. So whereas back in the 80s, even like the music videos told a story, like it was a mini movie kind of thing, you know, whereas like nowadays it's just like scenes in clubs, girls dancing here, guys dancing there, and that's about it, you know. But and the actual message that they're giving isn't like, you don't learn anything from the music today. Like it's like, oh, I make money, I do this, I do that, bam, that's the music.
But wouldn't you say that's like a reaction, or that's almost like trying to make sense with the society that exists today rather than the society in the 80s and 90s where there was so much like political repression against blacks or minorities, etc. Whereas today in America, ideally you have some equality amongst the entire group of people in the society.
But do you really?
So do you think that complacency is a result because America's now post-racial and they've resolved all their racial problems apparently?
Yeah, Trump's election totally changed.
But with Obama's presidency, that almost came about this time where people are like, okay, a black person is now president, racism is over, we can all relax now.
But isn't that
I
funny
don't-
that
I
it
don't
takes
know.
one black president to like show that racism no longer exists? That's crazy.
Racism so exists.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
totally.
don't we still need those strong messages where it's like, it's not like racism just stopped in the 80s, you know what I mean? It's not like oppression or any of that stuff stopped in the 80s. It's still happening
But
today.
we still have movements, I guess, like Black Lives Matter still
Yeah.
today, which shows that people are still aware of that and
Yeah.
they still feel the need to fight for it.
But they have short-term
not
memory,
in-
don't they?
It's-
Because they have the need to fight for it when the shooting occurs, but they don't really have the need to fight for it when
That's what I'm
like
saying.
no shootings occur, and there's
Yeah.
almost a complacency within the black community itself.
And
I
if
wouldn't
hip hop
even-
is a form
Like
of
something has to
expression.
happen.
I
for
feel-
me to
Yeah,
notice.
exactly. Yeah, like a shock
What-
reaction.
Do you feel like Australia is a really racist country? Just as a general
It can
question.
be. It can be at times. I think it depends on who you are as a person.
Yeah.
And because what I found is that if you are like confident or whatnot, people just don't, like, I don't know how to put it. It's almost as if you show vulnerability, you can be a minority but be confident,
Yeah.
and you don't like attract as much racism. It's because you.
Today was a bit strange. I'm mixed, so I'm mixed white and black. And listening to a black person talk about the depth of what it's like to really suffer in a white privileged world, to me, I don't feel anything because I don't exactly know what to, like, I couldn't say anything the whole time. So there was like, because mainly there's the people that were in the group were just black people and white people, but I'm mixed, so I sit right in the middle and I can't say anything because I'm like, I don't think like they do, like they think completely different, like I just feel like normal, you know, but it's not that I don't feel like this isn't a white privileged world, because I do believe that it is, but I understand the struggle is real.
Have that.
Like, I don't know, but growing up in primary school, there was a big push for diversity and multiculturalism, etc. And that was mostly in regards to the migrant communities. Whereas with, I guess, Australia's Indigenous population, I think it's mostly them that suffer from the large amount of racism in this country, particularly structurally, like with rural areas being underfunded, with Aboriginal communities sometimes being banned from, being able to speak their languages at schools, etc., stuff like that. And that's still going on today.
Aboriginal people are banned
Yeah.
from speaking their language?
I think there was a push for...
In some rural areas.
Yeah, in
like
some
the
rural
Coopers.
areas, particularly in the Northern Territory, where they were trying to get the kids to learn English.
Yeah.
And so they were kind of, I guess, suppressing their native languages so
That's-
they could learn English.
Yeah, it
cultural
wasn't like the old
annihilation.
days
Yeah.
where it was like complete ban. It's more subtle.
And guess
It's more like
who-
knowing the curriculum.
Oh,
And the
but
best
even though
thing
it's
about
subtle,
that
it's still
was,
wrong.
okay, not the best thing, but the most incredible thing about that was the man who was pushing for that in 2004, Scott Morrison, is currently in our government and is,
Social
what does he do?
service minister or
Yeah.
immigration.
Yeah. So, and then we have Peter Dutton as well. So, you know,
That's not
just
good.
have a really interesting array of politicians right now.
Yeah. You're saying?
I reckon, I mean, like, just on the topic of racism, I actually feel like Australia is a very, very racist country.
Really?
Yeah, but I feel like it's all subtle.
Have
Whereas-
you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been here not long, and I've just realised that
Where are you
it's
from?
New Zealand.
Only two questions.
Yeah, Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
But like in New Zealand, like you hardly ever see like a person of colour.
Mm.
Like especially in the city I came from, it was quite small, and even seeing a person in a headscarf, like a Muslim person, unless you knew them, you won't see that. Unless you personally actually knew them,
Really?
you wouldn't see that. You
Wow.
know, so there were like no black people, and everyone knew each other. Everyone knew each other if they were a person of colour. But here I realised that there's so many people of colour that, and I realised that Australians are not friendly. Like, they don't talk to people. Where in New Zealand, like, someone will bump up to you and you'll stop and have a like good conversation with them, you know, as if they're your neighbour. But in Australia, it's just each their own. They won't look at you, they won't talk to you.
Well, yeah, like they'll talk to you, but they'll be like, "G'day, mate, how you going?"
Yeah.
And then they walk away.
No, it's like a forced conversation, forced smile.
Yeah.
You know, like, I've been to like shopping malls, and if I ask the exit, they would look at me and just turn around.
Really?
And I'm just like, oh yeah, they'll like completely send me to the wrong direction, and I'm just like, I'm asking you a simple question, you know.
Yeah,
I'm not
that's-
asking to take your land like you did, you know.
It's crazy.
Cool. So today we talked about white privilege, and that I found so incredibly fascinating because I'm a white Australian, and I've always wanted to discuss this and actually see how much of this like a white Australian is responsible for, and a bunch of other different topics. But what I really found so fascinating about white privilege was that some people think it exists. I, as a white Australian, think it exists, and some other people think that it's not necessarily as good an idea to just blame white Australians for white privilege as much, but to think of a way to actually get rid of white privilege itself so that we actually just have an equal way of thinking. And that I agree with, and I think that that would be a really, really good idea to have, rather than to just say, well, white Australians are responsible for white privilege, therefore, you know, it's not white Australians are awful people. No, I think that the best thing that we can do is acknowledge, yes, white privilege exists, and if you just have a look at the difference between, say, life expectancy and education between white Australians and, say, Aboriginal Australians, you can have a look at the difference there. But I feel like the best way we can actually address white privilege is to say, how can we fix it? How can we make things equal? And how can we actually promote a new way of thinking?
Saying that, you know, we need to preserve our white identity because, you know, if you have a student union group, you can have the Sudanese student union or the Somali student union, but if you have the white student union, people will attack that because they're going to be like, well, why? But I don't think that's right.
Well, I guess, well, to be honest, it's more of a majority thing, isn't it? Had the white people actually been a ethnic minority, no one would ever complain about
But do you
them.
have to be an ethnic minority to take pride in your culture?
Not necessarily, but to create exclusive spaces, I think you should be a minority.
I think if we open to everyone taking pride in their heritage and their culture or whatever, then that will kind of diffuse the whole idea of privilege for this person or privilege for not that person. I guess.
Don't you see the problem in a hegemonic kind of majority creating its own exclusive spaces, which is only going to reinforce its own power since it's already a majority? So
I guess my problem with the whole idea of white privilege is there's so many, like for example with Vision Australia, I was reading some of their reports, and there's like thousands of white people here in Australia that are literally like not on the poverty line, but they're very, very poor. So you can't say to them, oh, you've got white privilege. I think privilege is more so an economic thing, and the racial aspect probably comes to play when you're doing more formal things.
Okay, yes, but white privilege literally isn't just a card they hand out to white people. It's a set of circumstances that makes you more likely to succeed in this current lifestyle.
And you can only infiltrate
But you know
those
what?
circumstances if you come from a powerful or rich white
That
community,
makes you
right?
more inclined, yes. And there's another interesting idea as well. Whiteness not necessarily being with like ethnically white. It's almost it could be, for instance, going to a good private school and then landing a really amazing job. You have some degree of whiteness in that
Like being a
regard
tall, skinny girl
because
with blue eyes, you know, that's
exactly.
white privilege.
So it's less a almost
Color.
ethnicity does play a huge part of it, but it's more of a set of
Yeah,
circumstances.
you have to fit into the requirements, you know.
Yeah.
I
Are
think.
you saying
Yeah,
like
but-
you'll never see an Aboriginal as a prime minister?
I would love to.
I would love to. I don't think it's going to happen for a long time.
I personally would love to, but I wouldn't say an Aboriginal person becoming a prime minister all of a sudden means that Aboriginal people don't have
Well,
any
you have
issues.
to, when you're talking about that, you
in
have
the
to look
society.
at it probability-wise. Because
Which is why I support these companies that basically hold out certain employment positions for people,
For
of,
people
that
of that
background. So that could be more
Diversity.
reality.
Yeah. No, I feel like on like white privilege is just because it's easier for white people than maybe some other cultures. Like we're talking about, you know, the difference between life expectancy, employment, and a couple of other things between white Australians and, say, Aboriginal Australians. There's a big gap, and even that just basically says that there's a bit of a white privilege where white people actually have it easier than, say, Aboriginal people. I think immigrants also have it worse than white Australians.
Also, that average people in Australia probably have it easier than Aboriginal people because they don't have to face those issues. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Do you really?
I think.
So just really appreciative to be part of Roots TV's workshop today. We covered a lot of interesting, somewhat controversial topics, especially that of the music industry's influence on youth culture, white privilege and stuff like that. And what I most appreciated was, even though I guess my opinion was quite different from the rest of the group, but at least being in an atmosphere where we could actually exchange ideas and stuff like that. On a topic such as white privilege, I guess for me, it really came down to the fact that what I believe is that white privilege is not active, it's more so a perception, and it's only a perception that benefits people who choose to either be a victim of it or people who choose to take opportunity on it because they fit a certain white class, and I don't think that white class is applicable to all white people, hence my problem with the overriding term white privilege. But yeah, it was quite interesting. We spoke about Trump. It was great.
I think I can at least grasp what you're trying to get at. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I also feel like why there is a bit of white privilege, maybe even just what racism from white people, is because it's hard for us to actually just treat people from different backgrounds the same as we would anybody else. And I feel like that, maybe that's a thing from different culture. When one culture meets another culture, it's hard to treat them the same.
I think it's just human nature, to be honest. Like, you're going to be more favourable with someone who's more like yourself, than someone who's unknown to you.
Exactly, which is why I think white privilege for the most part is a perception, and a perception that really legitimizes itself based on the history of colonial settler states, etc. But since we know that there's no policies that overtly favour white people over non-white people.
Sorry, there is.
There is.
There really is.
What policy?
Yeah. For example, like when a white person...
The policy?
Wow.
No, really, is that
For
a policy?
example, when a white person commits a crime, and in social, like in media, they're said as a lone wolf.
Oh, yeah.
But when some person of colour commits a crime, it's the whole community.
What about
But that's not a
school they
policy
went
though.
to.
That's
media
Policies are not the only
No,
thing
no.
that shape country.
No.
exactly what I'm trying to say. So if we can see past the policy side, which doesn't exist, and if we can view it more so as an attitude and a perception, then we can break away from that
It's an
white
attitude and
privilege
perception
reality.
reinforced
So do you think
by
white-
the
white-
government.
white
Yeah.
privilege-
For example, the Dylan Roof guy, whatever his
Yeah.
name is, that shot a black church up, he's getting
Yeah.
a life sentence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So if there was white privilege, then he would be out by
He would
now.
be out, yeah.
And people
Really?
were saying, "Oh, he got a
Maybe the
Burger
white-
King
excuse-
meal." That's
Counselor,
part of the
Counselor.
law.
Maybe the
You
white
have to give them a
privilege
meal.
is that he wasn't shot and was actually
that he actually lived to go to
he
jail.
actually made it to his trial.
And that
Yeah,
and it
gross.
wasn't told in media that it was
No,
all
but
white
white
people
people-
that
But he
were part
wasn't-
of this.
Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, he did the shootings, and
Do
then
you know
like
what happened to that guy who was suspected of shooting the officers in Dallas at the Black Lives Matter march?
No.
He was merely suspected of that, and he got shot and killed.
Wow.
Which is why, first of all, I think there's huge issues in the police regulation, whatever
And racism,
system
yeah.
in America, and the policymakers are aware of that, which is why they're always trying to push forward for actual internal review on matters, etc. And I'm not saying they're perfect. I think there's
And that's how the.
I think there's a racist element in America's police system, but I don't.
What
think,
about Australia's?
Yes.
I don't know
But-
Australia.
You don't know.
I know that.
No,
I know that Aboriginal people and Sudanese people and people of African descent are more likely to go to jail in Australia than
What about deaths in
anyone
police
else.
custody?
What about death
But is
in
that
jail?
exclusive to minorities? I mean, are you saying they
I mean, the rates are much higher for minorities, aren't
I
they?
think the reasons
Particularly
why
Indigenous
people
Australians.
of minority background get longer
Sorry, did you say
prisons.
white people of minority background?
No, I didn't say that.
That's all right. Keep going.
No, I think the reason to why, for example, you always hear about. No, you guys are making me sound like
No,
I'm
you're fine.
supporting this. No, for example, people would always say, "Oh, look, if a white kid does a burglary, he gets 5 days in prison, a black kid will get 15 years.
They should get the same sentence.
But you have to take into account the reason to why it's a lot harsher on the black kid is not because he's black, it's because first of all you have to take into account a lot of black juveniles have a history of delinquency. They have got a history of doing stuff like this. So any judge will take that.
Make the
It doesn't
crime
stereotype.
less.
No, if
So
if
what
the
you're
first time.
saying,
whether you're white or black,
just
if
white?
you have a history of criminal activity, your sentence will be way harder than someone who
you
doesn't.
didn't really answer the
Yeah.
question there. Okay, let's take it that the black kid and the white kid have the exact same history.
Then
You
I would
do the
like
exact
to.
same
I would like
crime
to see a case
today.
where a white kid and a black kid have the exact same criminal history and they get two complete different sentences.
Okay,
I don't think that ever exists.
What about
Yeah.
that lady
Yeah.
that went to prison because she was driving, she did a mistake, and the police took her to the police cell and put her in prison, and they tasered her even though she had a heart problem, and they killed her. They covered the cameras, and they didn't get anything.
And what happened to
Nothing.
this? Nothing.
Nothing happened.
Which
to
is a
them.
problem that we need to solve.
What about
Police
the
Yeah.
stand
It's awful.
your
Black
ground
kids
law
and
that
nothing
got
happens
George
to them,
Zimmerman
and
off?
that is what I
And
call
there
white
was
privilege.
a
Yeah, absolutely.
and then
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
was a similar case in the same year, I believe, or maybe the year before, of a black woman who was using that same law to defend herself against her abusive husband, who had or was it ex-husband or something, I don't know, but he pretty much trespassed, and she fired a warning shot into the air, and she got jail time, and George Zimmerman.
There are so many white women that get such harsh jail sentences for killing their spouse. Spousal affairs is
She
super
shot the
harsh
rifle
in
in his
America.
What about where these cameras, these evidence, there's everything that you can point at the person that killed the person, and they don't get anything. It's
Why
happened
do you have so much
many
faith
times.
in the law when
Yeah.
the law
I
has
don't know. Look,
do you
our
think
lawyers,
policy
honestly,
actually
lawyers-
shapes
it's
a
not
lot of
that.
it?
I guess what I'm trying to say is all these like isolated, okay, I wouldn't say they're isolated, but all these patterns of incidences of, police brutality or racial discrimination, I do believe they exist. And I think most of the world is aware of that. And I think that's why there's a strong push to regulate that type of policy nowadays.
Yes.
But at the same time, I don't think that the overarching judicial system is racist. I mean, for example, majority of American prisons are filled by minorities. But those minorities have indeed committed the crimes that they have indeed committed and do come from a criminal history background that they do come from. People are not making this up. So what I would push for is a better education system and a better community support system within those communities, because there is high rates of crime within the Hispanic or the black community. And I don't think that's a racial thing. I think that's probably a cultural thing, which goes back to what you're saying about the 80s music and all that.
Specify exactly what you mean
It's like
by
when
a
you ask
cultural
them
thing.
why.
I think it's definitely a cultural
They go
thing.
back to the black and black crime.
Yeah, but that's besides the point.
like, that's
Okay,
not-
let's
that's
bring
not
it all the way
the
back
topic
down.
here.
Do you think that white privilege exists here in Australia?
I think that white privilege definitely exists, but I don't think it's a standard norm that people make it sound out to be.
What do you think white
I think you
privilege
have to be a white person who's privileged in a certain economic way
Yeah.
to actually receive white privilege. You can't just be white, like what you were saying.
Yeah, but look, privilege is seeing the same people that look like you and sound like you on TV. Seeing the people that look like
Okay,
you and
so
sound
black
like
people
you
have
in high
complete privilege
positions.
in the music
No.
industry.
Wait, though, right? In all walks of life, all from when you were younger
But they don't
to
win the
when you were
Grammys.
there, right? You're not being put down. That only happened
let me
now.
play devil's
It
ad-
didn't happen like millions of years
me
ago.
play
Okay,
devil's
before you play
advocate.
devil's advocate,
Yeah.
what I want to say is this: I think it's a cultural problem. I don't think it's a racial problem.
You still
I
haven't
think
specified what you
The
mean
white
by
guys say
culture.
it
Yeah.
exists.
yeah, the what? Okay, what I mean by culture is that when, for example, due to slavery and then due to the civil rights movement, you had minority communities almost ghettoized and locked away in a certain ghetto, and that obviously created the proliferation of certain cultural values. And I mean, for
Also, you think those
Does that not
cultural
still
values...
exist?
Okay, I'll tell you what. Here's what proves
Wind
my
up.
point. I will wind
Putting
up.
them in jail.
For example, right now they're trying to legalize marijuana, right?
Yeah.
But you don't see any people of minority background that are benefiting off the legalization of marijuana. Who's it all going to? Rich white folks that know how to work the legal system to legalize marijuana and import
And
it
if
legally.
that's not white
and
privilege, I don't understand
who
what
was
it is.
losing out? You have the blacks and the Hispanics that do that stuff and have been doing that stuff, the whole marijuana selling and all that, for decades in the ghettos. So of course it's a cultural problem when a certain community does not have the educational level to actually create opportunity from the policies that are being implemented.
Okay, so what culture?
Well, I actually
You
agree
keep
with you
saying
in some
cultural
aspects.
problem.
Oh my god, it is a cultural problem.
What
Yeah,
culture?
okay.
Australian
One
culture?
sec.
No, I will say minority culture, for example, Hispanic culture or African American culture or white culture.
I think what
Yeah.
you're getting mixed up is you're confusing African American culture for oppression.
No, not
I
at
think
all.
because like the same way that white privilege is a set of circumstances that happens to benefit people who fit into those, I guess whatever they fit into. You're
White
confusing
privilege is when
that-
like someone
that
tells
same
you
systematic
that,
oppression.
What I'm saying is white
for
privilege is a
African
perception.
American culture.
That's all I'm saying.
I reckon that the only way that you can actually change that perception, or make it more equal, is if you fight for a persona which is more like what you are thinking.
Which is why we need more socio-cultural movements like Black Lives Matter or whatever, because the policy side's already there. But the policy can only do so much until society
But we
actually
wouldn't need those
mobilizes
if
itself.
white
And,
privilege
I mean, until
exists.
they start to think that it is a little bit better than, well, I mean, like, if you expect people to behave a certain way, if you expect there to be racism, if you expect there to be something like that, then people will act off that. It's priming a certain condition of behaving. Whereas if you have the mindset of, well, it's not great, but it can be better, there isn't this whole problem, then you can actually address a new way of thinking and a new way
Which
of
is why
behaving.
community leadership in minority communities is so much needed.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can actually approach it from the perspective of, well, it's not great, but we can do better, and that is the goal, rather than necessarily just saying, well, it is completely awful, which, I mean, there are awful things happening, and there definitely is white privilege. I think that there is, but if you can find ways to actually think of it in a way like, well, there is white privilege, but how can we approach it so that it's less? How can we improve it? How can we actually just focus on making it better instead of just saying, well, everything's awful? I feel like I agree with you a little bit on this one.
Thank you.
No, I feel like you can only ever improve a situation if you're willing to improve it.
And if you're willing to no longer act or feel as a complete victim and understand that there's so many opportunities that you and your community can benefit of to change that stereotype, and then by that way create a reality that